Before we start, a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button. Only 4% of my channel is subscribed. When it reaches 1,000 subscribers, I will release a special video. Hans Bjornsson farmed in the remote Swedish countryside, where the horizon stretched on forever and the air smelled pure and crisp. The farm was an age-worn, quaint place, nestled in between the heavy stands of pine and the gentle undulations of wildflower meadows, bordered by a silver thread of river, which meandered with ancient laziness. The red barn and thatched roof of the main house seemed to speak of simpler times and hardy generations. Hans, with a weathered face and hands as gnarled as the old oak by his porch, has known this land from the cradle. Every morning, when the sun is casting its first golden hues over dew-laden fields, he pulls on his sturdy boots and woolen jacket. The ritual is as familiar as his own reflection, etched with the passage of many seasons. His day started with the chickens, their clucking a cheerful cacophony to break the stillness of dawn. He swung feed with practiced momentum, the rising sun causing his eyes to crinkle. The goats were next on his list, and they often put a rare smile on his lips with their playful antics. He checked their water and feed with movements as methodical as a dance honed by decades of hard work. The very solitariness of his life is a garment he wears comfortably, yet underneath there always lingers a shadow of loneliness. There were times that Hans paused in the midst of his chores, his eyes wandering over the land. There was something in his eyes, waiting for what though he could not tell. It needs him, the farm, and it gives enough back to fill his days, but not always his heart. By noon, Hans would be sitting in the shadow of the great oak, among the rustling leaves that told him tales no other human could hear. He would unwrap a sandwich, the bread homemade, the cheese from his goats. Eating would be a slow affair, often accentuated by thoughtful silences. Sometimes he would talk to his wife, Anna, who left this world many winters ago. He would say such things as, "The tomatoes are coming in well," or, "The roof could use new thatching before winter." His words would float up into the branches accompanied by the rustle of leaves. He waters the vegetable garden in the afternoons, fingers playing in the dirt, professional, urging growth with tender murmurs. For this is a space of company more than for sale. The garden is a tapestry of greens with bursts of color from the flowers. The buzz of bees, the floral perfume, all of it together. Here, lets Hans dream of other places, other lives. Perhaps in another world he could be a traveler, a seeker of mysteries. But the farm calls him back always, real with its needs and unspoken demands, grounding him in reality. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky pink and orange, Hans worked on the old wooden fence by the meadow. Hard work, leaving his body aching in ways that had become too familiar. There was still satisfaction in seeing the straight new boards and knowing the boundary was secure, that his small world was tended to. It finds him back on the porch, a cup of strong coffee warming his hands as twilight settles like a soft blanket. The stars begin their slow dance across the heavens, and the moon, a slender crescent, smiles down at him. Really, it is at this time of quiet when the most poignant pain of loneliness is felt by Hans, a whisper in his heart speaking of yearning, of faint hopes for something more than just another day. A very faint noise has started, a quiet hum that gets louder and louder to break the silence tonight. Hans stands, forgetting the coffee. His eyes scan the darkening skies. Beyond the tallest pines, a flare of brilliant light flickers through the branches, an anomaly in his familiar night. His heart starts beating faster, curiosity masked by fear. He looks at the light plunging into the forest with a muffled thud. For a long moment he just stood there, sandwiched between alarm and wonder, and then with a determination he never knew he carried inside him, he picked up a flashlight and made his way to the forest. The very world that had always seemed so predictable had been tipped off its axis, and Hans felt adventure stir within him once again, despite his years. Chapter 2. A crash in the night. The night was crisp, the stars blinking quietly above the gentle undulations of the Swedish countryside. Hans had just settled beside the fireplace, the flames casting a warm, flickering light across the walls of his rustic living room. The clock ticked soothingly, marking the passage of time with the kind of relentless precision that Hans found both comforting and a little melancholic. Outside, the breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of winter. It was on such a night that the extraordinary pierced the veil of Hans's routine life. The silence was shattered by a distant crash, a sound unlike any falling tree or startled animal he was accustomed to. It was metallic, resonant, and unmistakably foreign. Hans's heart skipped a beat. Instinctively he rose from his chair, his old bones protesting slightly, curiosity already lighting the path ahead. Grabbing a flashlight and pulling on his coat, Hans stepped outside. The air was sharp against his face, and his breath materialized as tiny clouds in the cold night air. He hesitated, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, aiming towards the dense forest that bordered his farm. The unknown beckoned. With each step, the soil and fallen leaves crunched under his boots. Hans's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be poachers, or perhaps some wayward teenagers? But the unsettling nature of the noise suggested something far from mundane. As he neared the source, a faint, eerie glow seeped through the trees, pulsating gently, casting ghostly shadows on the ground. It was not the warm glow of a campfire, but something otherworldly. Pushing through a final thicket, Hans came upon the scene. There, embedded in a small clearing, lay a spacecraft of sleek design and unfamiliar markings, its hull steaming slightly as it cooled in the night air. It was partially buried in the earth, having carved a ragged trench through the forest floor on its descent. The sight stole Hans's breath. Never in his wildest musings had he imagined encountering the alien so literally. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he approached, the light glinting off the metallic surface of the ship. The craft was compact, hardly larger than his tractor, with a surface that shimmered with a luster that no earthly metal possessed. Hans circled it slowly, a mix of fear and fascination propelling him forward. It was then he noticed the hatch, slightly ajar, a soft light spilling out. "Hello?" His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the enormity of what stood before him. There was no response, only the soft hum of the spacecraft's damaged systems. Gathering his courage, Hans edged closer, peering inside the hatch. There, slumped against the controls, was Alara. Her skin was an ethereal silver blue, shimmering faintly in the dim light, her features delicate, yet distinctly non-human. Her breaths were shallow, her face contorted in pain. Hans's first impulse was to retreat, to run back to the safety of his familiar world. But as he watched her struggle for breath, a deeper, more commanding impulse took hold. She was alone and hurt, so very far from home. With a steadiness he hadn't felt in years, Hans reached into the spacecraft, his hands gently cradling Alara. He spoke softly, reassuringly, as he would to a frightened animal. "It's all right. I've got you." Carefully he carried her back through the woods, the weight of her surprisingly light in his arms. Each step towards his farm was a step further from the world he knew. Each breath a silent pact between the stars above and the old earth beneath his feet. That night, as the remnants of his solitary life flickered in the fireplace's dying embers, Hans's world expanded beyond the farthest reaches of his imagination. In his small, secluded farm, under the vast, indifferent sky, a new chapter was beginning. One written in the light of distant stars and the quiet resolve of an earthly heart. Chapter 3. Unlikely Companions. The soft glow of dawn bathed the old farm in a serene light, a daily spectacle that Hans had come to greet with quiet resignation. On this morning, however, The routine tranquility of his world was shadowed by the unexpected presence of Ilara, the alien woman, who now rested in his spare room, her spacecraft hidden beneath the dense canopy of his forest. Hans stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, staring out at the dew-laden fields that stretched toward the horizon. His thoughts were tangled with wonder and wariness, an internal tumult that was unfamiliar in his years of solitude. He turned from the window, his eyes settling on the closed door behind which Ilara slept. With a deep, steadying breath, he acknowledged the reality of the situation. There was no turning back now. By the time Ilara emerged, the sun was high, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the farmhouse. Hans had decided that whatever fears he harbored, hospitality would not be a casualty. "Good morning," he said, his voice more steady than he felt. "I hope you slept well." Ilara paused at the doorway, her gaze sweeping the quaint kitchen. "Yes, thank you, Hans," she replied, her voice a melodic contrast to the rustic surroundings. "Your home is very comforting." Hans nodded, motioning towards the table laden with bread, homemade jams, and fresh milk. "Breakfast is ready. You'll need to eat," he said, practicality lacing his words. They had agreed last night to assess the damage to her ship today. As they ate, the silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the occasional rustle of the morning breeze through the open window. Hans watched Ilara, noting the graceful way she moved, so controlled and deliberate. He couldn't help but wonder about the world that had shaped her. "So," Hans began, clearing his throat slightly, "tell me about where you come from. What is it like?" Ilara looked up, her eyes reflecting a twinkle of interest. "My planet, Elysiara, is quite different from Earth. Our cities float above the land, held aloft by technology you might find quite fantastical. The skies are bright with ships, much like the one I came here in, and the fields are always in bloom, regulated by our climate systems." Hans listened, rapt. The image of a world so technologically advanced yet evidently in tune with nature was compelling. "It sounds beautiful," he said genuinely. "It is," Ilara sighed, a trace of melancholy in her tone. "But it's also lonely in a way. When you live among such wonders, sometimes the simple beauty of a quiet life, of a place like this," she gestured around, "is forgotten." Moved by her reflection, Hans felt a kinship stir within him. "I suppose that's one thing we have in common then," he mused, "a longing for connection." Their eyes met, and a mutual understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared solitude. The morning passed into afternoon as they ventured to the site of the crash. The spacecraft was indeed a technological marvel, sleek and silver, jarringly alien against the backdrop of the rustic Swedish forest. They assessed the damage together, Ilara guiding Hans on what to look for, explaining the function of components that were utterly foreign to him. As Hans handed her tools and held lights, he found himself fascinated not only by the technology, but by Ilara herself. She worked with a precision and confidence that spoke of a deep knowledge of her craft, yet there was a gentleness to her touch, a reverence for the intricate machinery. "This is the propulsion matrix," Ilara explained, pointing to a complex arrangement of metallic rings and pulsating lights. "It's damaged, but I believe with the right materials we can repair it." "And you'll teach me?" Hans asked, his tone half joking. Ilara smiled, her eyes bright. "Yes, I'll teach you." In that moment, amid the alien debris and the earthy smell of the forest, a bond forged in the crucible of circumstance strengthened. Hans and Ilara, the farmer and the alien, found themselves not just as unlikely companions, but as partners in a quest that was about much more than mere survival or repair. It was about understanding, about bridging worlds through the simple yet profound acts of sharing and learning. And as the shadows grew long and the first stars blinked into the evening sky, Hans felt a part of something greater, a narrative unfolding that was as exciting as it was terrifying. Chapter 4: Challenges and Revelations. The golden glow of dawn filtered through the curtains of Hans's farmhouse, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floor. The peaceful silence of the morning was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of activity that had overtaken Hans's life since Ilara's unexpected arrival. Today, like every day since the crash, would be dedicated to repairing the spacecraft, a task both daunting and thrilling for an elderly farmer whose closest encounters with technology involved an old tractor and a temperamental television set. Hans and Ilara had set up a makeshift workshop in his barn, where the spacecraft's engine components were spread out like the pieces of a giant, inscrutable jigsaw puzzle. Ilara, her skin catching the iridescent morning light, moved among the pieces with a grace that belied her urgency. Her hands, slender yet impossibly strong, adjusted a conduit here, a wire there, her movements fluid and precise. Hans watched her for a moment, his gaze lingering on the curve of her cheek, the intense focus in her eyes. "What's this piece?" he asked, picking up a cylindrical object that glowed faintly blue. "That's a quantum stabilizer," Ilara explained without looking up. "It helps maintain the phase coherence of the drive field. Without it, well, we wouldn't get very far." "Quantum stabilizer," Hans repeated, rolling the foreign words around his tongue. He placed the piece gently back on the table, feeling its light vibration under his fingers, a whisper of otherworldly secrets. The days spent working on the spacecraft were long and fraught with challenges. Each component was a puzzle within a puzzle, technology so advanced that they bordered on magic to Hans. Yet, under Ilara's patient guidance, he was learning. More than that, he was helping. But the work was not just technical. It was also secretive. They had to be cautious, avoiding the curious eyes of neighbors and the occasional hiker. Hans had told a few inquisitive souls that he was helping a relative fix up an old car. Part truth, part lie. A story believable enough to satisfy without inviting further questions. As they worked, Ilara shared stories of her planet, of cities that floated in the sky and rivers that sang. Hans listened, enraptured, as she described the luminous night flowers that bloomed under her world's twin moons, their petals unfolding with light. It seemed a fairy tale, a stark contrast to his own earthy world of crops and cattle. Yet, as fascinated as he was by her stories, Hans couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that grew in his chest. With each component they repaired, Ilara was one step closer to leaving. And what would his world be once again without her light? It was late afternoon when they encountered a significant setback. A critical energy distributor had a crack too fine for human eyes, but not for Ilara's. The tiny fracture could jeopardize the entire system, potentially stranding her here, or worse, failing mid-flight. Hans sensed her frustration as she explained the problem. "We need to synthesize a replacement, but that requires materials and tools we don't have here," Ilara said, her voice tight with worry. Hans thought for a moment, his mind racing. "What about the old university lab in town? My niece works there. Maybe she can help us get what we need." Ilara looked at him, hope rekindling in her eyes. "That could work," she said, a small smile breaking through her concern. The plan was risky, but necessary. Together they prepared for the trip into town, disguised under the pretense of visiting Hans's niece for a family dinner. As they drove, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the fields, the light flickering through the trees like a silent promise. Their journey into town was not just a quest for a piece of alien technology. It was a testament to their growing bond, to the trust and camaraderie that had blossomed between a lonely farmer and a stranded alien. And as they walked into the lab later that night, Hans felt a surge of pride. Here he was, embarking on an adventure that spanned the stars, driven by a friendship that was fast becoming the most significant connection of his life. Little did he know, The challenges they faced today would pale in comparison to what was coming. As they returned to the farm that night, with the necessary materials secured under the cloak of darkness, both felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. They were one step closer to their goal, but each step took Alara closer to departure, and Hans deeper into the unknown realms of his own heart.